Thank you, Deputy President, and I'll rise to speak on this bill. Despite Mr Finn's assertions that this is some giant conspiracy for some, amorphous foreign force to take us over and, take the information out of our brains and do some other conspiratorial things. This is actually a very sensible piece of legislation. It's a very sensible treaty that we signed 5 years ago as a country, and it has been progressively being rolled out around the world and certainly around Australia. The monitoring of places of detention, Mr Finn, places of detention, the place where Mr Finn would like to see everyone locked up forever. And I have never heard Mr Finn defend the rights of people in prison before. But, new things happen in here all the time. This is the monitoring of places of detention by the United Nations Subcommittee on the Prevention of Torture. The prevention of torture. This is important. This is legislation that, as I say, has been in the process of being implemented for a number of years. Now, I don't think we're going to get it perfect, because this is looking at how we introduce the monitoring of places of detention, how we work out how we do that monitoring, and how we enabled the United Nations Subcommittee on the Prevention of Torture to be able to access our places of detention. And this is it. It is places of detention. It is our prisons. It is our secure care, our mental health secure care. It is our youth detention. By way of hoping that rather than going into too much committee on this, I do have a question around whether this legislation would also enable that subcommittee to access prison cells, which would also be part of, a place of detention under the definition of this Act. But I'm not certain from reading the bill or reading the second reading whether police cells would also be accessible for, would be operated, would actually come under this domestic national preventative mechanism. And this is a treaty and a piece of legislation that was much talked about during the inquiry into the criminal justice system. That inquiry, which, as many of you who took part in, received submissions from hundreds of organisations around our state and around our country. It has presented over 100 recommendations. It runs to 2 volumes. It is a substantive piece of work. Sadly, the government is due to respond to it by the 24th of September at the latest. And I'm afraid today is the 19th and tomorrow is the 20th. So I would hope that the government may have actually started work on that and might be able to provide this House with a response to that report tomorrow. Unfortunately, I don't hold my breath, because even substantive reports like the inquiry into homelessness and the inquiry into the use of cannabis have remained unanswered by the government. But this legislation, despite, again, I refer back to Mr Finn's concerns about people, getting our secret information, this is actually also about protecting the privacy of those in detention. And this legislation sets out some very good protective parameters to protect the privacy of detained people. And as it says in the second reading speech, ensure detained or other persons who provide information to the subcommittee are protected. And not only that their privacy is protected, but they're protected from reprisal. And I have certainly been in the inquiries that I have been involved in when we've had the opportunity to visit juvenile justice detention centres, where we've had the opportunity to visit prisons both in Melbourne and regionally. There is that fear of reprisal. People are fearful of making complaints, of speaking up, for fear that that will come back and bite them. And anecdotal experience would say that that actually does happen. So this is very welcomed, and we heard this from numerous organisations in Victoria that gave evidence to the Criminal Justice Inquiry that OPCAT was going to provide some of the answers to questions around the unnecessary use of restraints, the use of solitary confinement in unnecessary circumstances. In part of what we were hearing, and in some of the issues that were raised, even in the inquiry into the impact of parental incarceration on children, we were hearing around circumstances where mothers were being shackled during childbirth if they were operating out of a prison. Now, this is just something that a modern society like Victoria would not countenance, and it needs to be exposed if it is occurring, and it needs to stop happening. Mothers being shackled and handcuffed when they were taken to the doctor for neonatal care of their babies, and kept in handcuffs until the doctor required that those handcuffs be removed. This is the type of activity that OPCAT and this legislation and the monitoring of these places will provide the much needed sunlight. There was much concern during that inquiry around the secrecy around private prisons, and we know we've privatised many of our prisons in Victoria, and they are multi-billion-dollar industries. And I myself have been caught when asking questions around the operation of these prisons and the organisations that run them. I've been caught by ministers telling me that that's commercial in confidence. That won't be the case under this legislation. This legislation will ensure that that there is a level of transparency in prison conditions, and it will address some of the problematic practices that we heard about during our inquiry. Again, an inquiry that the government hasn't responded to, but I would encourage them to, even if they don't get a chance today, even if tomorrow, if they could even agree to just some of the recommendations, and I would look in line with the spirit of this legislation, Recommendation 82, which calls on the Victorian Government to review the use of solitary confinement, physical restraints and strip searching in Victorian prisons, with a view to introducing policy to regulate the use of these practices. Let's not leave it to the UN to tell us what to do. We know that this is wrong. We know that when we are strip searching women in the Dame Phyllis Frost prison, who over 90% of them, in fact almost all of them, have got experiences of trauma and experiences of sexual violence and family violence, we are further traumatising them through the practices in that prison. And that must end. Now, this legislation will go some way to shining that light, but I think there's things that we can do without having to call, without having to wait for the UN subcommittee to look at this. And the Fitzroy Legal Service in my region also concurred with this, saying that OPCAT alone isn't enough, because we know the first-hand importance of organisations like our community legal centres in shining a light. We are awaiting with trepidation the coroner's report on Miss Veronica Nelson, an Aboriginal woman who died in custody under extraordinary conditions. And it was an absolute tragedy. It showed everything that is wrong with some of our bail laws, but it also showed what was wrong with the health services that are provided in our prisons. We are now, and my heart pounds as I say this, we are now having a coronial inquest into a baby that died in a prison. A baby that died, and I would say that baby would not have died if that baby had the same health services that you and I have outside of prison. And this is some of the reason why OPCAT is so important, is to ensure that transparency is there, to ensure that these practices where health services are denied is not allowed to happen in our prisons and in our detention centres in Victoria. Now, the Jesuit Social Services also is calling for the urgent implementation of OPCAT. But again, they said that, they cautioned that implementing OPCAT, as this bill will do, cannot address all the issues in the criminal justice system, and advocated for change in other areas, more transformative change. Now, I am harping on this, but I would refer the government to the committee's inquiry into the criminal justice system, where we made numerous recommendations and findings in this area. We need to look at how we keep people out of prison and not continue to expand our prisons and build new ones. And, I despair when I see Cherry Creek being built right next to an adult prison. Is that the message that we're sending young people who are some of our most disadvantaged children in our community? The message we're sending them is, your next stop is next door. This is what we need to change. And we heard this very loudly and clearly from the Victorian Aboriginal Legal Service, the Aboriginal Justice Caucus, many of the other ACCHOs and in particular VACCHO, who all gave evidence to say that what we're doing now is inadequate. And what they also stressed, and I would hope that, and I would like to be optimistic and have confidence that in the rollout of this, as we develop the framework for monitoring places of detention by the subcommittee, that we will ensure that subcommittee understands the cultural significance, that understands that they do this in a culturally appropriate way, and that it's safe for Aboriginal people. So as we know, we are still locking up more Aboriginal people than anyone else in our community per capita. We are still seeing deaths in custody of Aboriginal people in our prisons in Victoria. My heart goes out to the family and friends of people like Veronica Nelson. My heart goes out to the family and friends of all people who have died in custody, but in particular the families and friends of the Aboriginal people who have died in our custody. This is why, while OPCAT is one measure, and it is a significant and it is an important measure that we take, we need to wholeheartedly consider how we detain people, why we detain people, and how we can improve our criminal justice system. Now, I note that there was about $500,000 put forward for the funding of OPCAT in the budget. We know that won't be enough. I understand that the minister is in communication with the federal government around providing significantly more funding for this. I hope that is forthcoming, because we want this to work, but it won't work if it's not properly funded. We want to see that OCPAT operates alongside the Ombudsman, operates alongside IBAC, so that we can have, we can have faith that our prison structures are doing what they're supposed to do, and that is ensuring that while protecting the community, we are also rehabilitating people in prison, and that we are not unnecessarily detaining people, which I'd have to say we are right now, when the majority of women in our prisons in Victoria are there on remand. They are unsentenced. So I welcome this legislation, but I do please urge the government, implore the government to consider the report of the Legal and Social Issues Committee, the very hard work that so many organisations, non-government organisations, put into that report, the number of people with lived experience who talked about their life in detention, talked about the experiences of that period of detention, talked about what we could do better. And OPCAT is certainly part of that toolbox of improving our system, but it's not the silver bullet, and we can do more. And that will be around bail reform, that will be around parole reform, that will be around drug law reform. All of these areas have to walk alongside OPCAT and the oversight that this legislation will bring to our detention centres. So while I welcome this legislation, I implore the government to do more.